So today I want to talk about the interface between digital health, behavioral science, and equity. And in particular, I want to try to make an argument that I think where we can be moving is balancing this, on one hand, trying to be more humanistic in our approach of really trying to honor the humanity and importance of each person, and then also managing the complexities that are inherent to that, taking more system sciences approaches. So first, just a few acknowledgements. I'm a scientific advisor to these groups, and I've been funded by these various organizations, and a lot of this work is funded through these great places. I also want to acknowledge that UC San Diego, the place I'm a professor at, resides on the unceded territory of the Kumeyaay Nation. And so this now, I like to always start my talk with where I'm ending my talk. And so this is basically the whole argument for the talk wrapped up in a little bow for now, which is first, on the one hand, I think it's, as I think about the complexity of human behavior and behavior change in context, and then extending that even more so into public health, which is a big reason why I moved from Arizona State to UC San Diego to become more involved in complex systems at the level of a city and a region and a community. The system science methods are really valuable to help us to match the complexity of the phenomenon we're trying to understand and ultimately help to make progress on to help people live healthier lives, exactly as Andrea was saying. In my mind, a key value of system science methods is it enable us to not necessarily just study the nouns, like what is happening, but how things happen and why. And I think about this in terms of focusing very clearly on the dynamics, the interconnectivity between things, and the flows within and across different systems. And I'll define what do I mean by systems in a moment. In particular, though, knowing that we are moving towards, at least what I work in, as an applied science, I'm very conscious on trying to not just understand how and why, but I'm also trying to think about how do we then translate that into supporting better decisions. So really supporting these dynamic and contextually grounded decisions. And I see system science methods playing a very important role in that. And last but not least, also recognizing that if you're taking a system science approach, again, as Andrew was kind of alluding to with this, I personally try to draw very much from a wide range of different fields. So sometimes from computer science now, sometimes from control systems, although today I'll just talk about control systems. And there's a variety of different ways of knowing and understanding things. And in my view, that's actually really pivotal for building a robust science. It's moving us towards consilience. And so I'll get into that a little bit. But really just focusing on control systems. So on one side, we want to basically match the complexity with methods that can handle it and to help us make better decisions and understand dynamics and flows. And on the flip side, though, I think it's also really important to remember, and this is the part of the humanistic piece, is that we are humans, we are trying to help other people. And I think that is, and I'll give some very personal examples and stories about this, but that is, I think, a far more complex and a higher calling than I think we classically think about in the type of science we're working in. So a big shift that has actually been happening in my own work is sort of trying to honor and cultivate and understand what it means to really do the science in a way that is equitable, ethical, and respectful of others than the people I'm trying to serve. And so while there's a lot more that I can get into with this, I'm just going to hit on three key areas. One is around mindsets, engaging and moving towards becoming more compassionate, curious, humble, and creative in our work. Working towards meaningfully partnering, not seeing our research subjects as subjects, but seeing them as full humans that are deserving of love and respect, and knowing how to actually do that in a way such that they can build checks on the work that we're building. And then ultimately working towards building a recentering. Because classically, I think the way that we've worked, and I don't think there was no bad intent here, but I think classically when we do our science, we tend to try to separate ourselves and play this role of objectivity. And I think that can work in a basic science context, but in an applied science context, it's really essential that we're centering on the success criteria and the ways that the people we're trying to serve actually view themselves. And so that's what I mean by this centering. And so I'm going to describe a little bit of sort of practices that I've been trying to build up that in many ways is sort of a check on these system science methods. In my mind, if we can put these things together, it establishes a pathway towards a more equitable applied behavioral science, where I think, personally, I think is where we want to be striving. So this is in essence the argument in this talk. And now I'll unpack all of this in great depth. So first, let me just get on a few key words. What do I mean by the word equity? You might have seen this. This is a very popular, variations of this cartoon is very popular here in the US right now. The difference between equality, which is basically everybody gets the same thing, to equity, people get what they need, and so that might mean that there's different things, coming back to this idea of understanding and honoring differences. And so I'm striving for equity here in thinking about how we do our applied science. And then what do I mean by the word system? Well, I personally really like this definition of a system: a delineated part of the universe which is distinguished from the rest, and this is key, by an imaginary boundary. And so what do I mean when I'm getting into this idea is, like, ultimately a system is something where there is something contained. So a human is a system, but so is a cell. A cell is a system. An organ is a system, right? And so is a city, you could think of as a system. They're all and so in particular, the way I try to think about this is recognizing that there are systems and systems, and the boundaries that we create are fluid and partially contingent on what our goal is and what our success criteria is. And I think that's really essential when we're trying to make progress on things, and why, for me, I tend to focus a lot more on verbs, if you will, over nouns, where I'm trying to understand how and why things are happening and changing, instead of focusing more on what they are. Because I think often, and hence why I really think much more about using systems rather than using words like what this one might suggest, even as you can see the word coming in, levels. Levels is implying a sort of idea that you can kind of understand and take snapshots. And as I've just been engaging with the complexity of human behavior and behavior change, I don't think that's a fair assumption. And so let me first make an argument on why I think that's the case. And so let's start with kind of the classic way that we've often do our studies, which is around group-based work, right? So you can imagine you run a randomized control trial, like my colleague and friend Christopher Gardner did, for weight loss. And what we do is we find that this is the average weight loss we find in a given group. We say, okay, great, this is successful. But the key important thing to remember is that that is an abstract idea. That's an abstraction from what actually happened. There were actually individual human beings who took part in that trial. And so for some people, for this person, they lost a whole lot of weight. For this person, they didn't actually lose any weight at all. And for this person, they actually gained weight. And almost all of that is lost in the ways that we're trying to understand this. And this is even just taking a snapshot. This is not understanding dynamics or anything else like that, right? But so when I'm thinking about weight, this seems like a gross oversimplification of what the complexity is involved in why someone might be overweight or not eating a particularly healthy diet or otherwise, right? And so the question is then, what are all those things that influence things like diet, weight, physical activity, and the sorts of things that we care about?
Eric?
Well, yes.
Just one thing. Can you speak a little bit more slowly?
Sure. Sorry, I will speak a little more. Sorry, I had tended to talk quick, so the New Yorker in me. But yes, I will try to speak more slowly.
A lot more slowly would be good.
What was that?
A lot more slowly might be good.
Okay, a lot more slowly it is. So why is human behavior complex? I think the short summary statement here that I'd like to head on is that context matters. It's not just that someone engages in behavior, the environment they exist within influences them. Perhaps the microbiome, the things happening within the skin, influence them. So do public health recommendations, as we're all experiencing with COVID, why I'm not in Zurich right now. And so I think a first thing to note is, in essence, that context matters. But then, of course, as I was just getting onto before, that it's not just that context matters, as if we can take a snapshot. Another key thing to think about is time, and recognizing that things are constantly changing. All of these things, so how our physiology, our learning history, how we're engaging with other people, how our built environment, how the weather patterns, the policies, the laws, the media, culture, all of these things are constantly evolving across time and co-influencing each other. And so it's suggesting really that, we want to be understanding really the time and the dynamics and the flows and the interactions between things. And then, of course, the last piece of this is then, if context matters and things change, well, then what this sets up is the likelihood that people will be different. There will be individual differences that manifest. And so that's sort of a high-level summary statement in terms of the assumptions I like to make. In essence, context matters, things change, and therefore people are different. And one minor note on the people are different. Notice I'm explicitly not saying people are different because of some genetic factor only. Of course, that plays a role, but that's a small part in my experience compared to the many different factors on how we each as individual humans evolve and become the people that we are. Hence this ordering of starting with context and not starting with people explicitly. So if that's the complexity we're working with, let's come back to the mismatch with our evidence. I would argue that a lot of the methods we're using, particularly randomized control trials, and anytime we're using this group-based work where we're really focusing on averages, a key goal implicit to what we're working on is trying to get towards, quote, universal truths. And of course, I'm not saying universal truths don't exist. I'm more of just speaking methodologically, what are the methods that we're using going to help us to get to? And so these are the questions like, does it, quote unquote, work? Right? And maybe we do things like add in moderation analyses or otherwise in subgroup analyses and whatnot. But if we think about the complexity that I just described, probably the type of evidence we want to generate is going to need to take into account people, place, and time a little bit more concretely, if not a little bit, a lot more, I would argue, in our work. Why? Because that's actually where the questions about how do things change and why actually exist. They exist in the flows and connections between things, between the systems. And so for me, this is why I've been really moving strongly away in the science and methods that I've been doing, away from the classic methods that I was trained in. In essence, I don't see those methods as giving us the information we need to help us to understand behavior and context. And so this is just sort of taking the science perspective. And actually, if I may, can I pause? Is this too fast still? Should I go slower?
Mine's okay.
This is a better rhythm? Okay. Thank you for slowing me down. It's the New Yorker in me. So continuing with that pace then. So that's just sort of trying to understand, right? But now we have an even higher burden in terms of the type of science we're trying to do because we're doing an applied science. And so the next set of questions is like, okay, well then what kind of decision are we trying to make? And how are we trying to help? And I would argue that the classic approach as it's set up sets us up to think like success is basically like a yardstick. You know, it's like, is someone in the BMI range of 18.5 to 25? Is someone engaging in 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity? And so forth and so on, right? We basically say that's what we're striving for. And by the way, that's an okay proxy. You'll see in the work that I'm describing, you can take that and use that to help you make a decision. But just kind of pushing this to the extreme, if you start really thinking about the true dynamics of this, particularly thinking about behavior, we're never engaging in just one behavior. There's all these different factors that are competing in a given moment on what we're doing. There is times for us to be moving. There is times for us to not move. There's times for us to eat. There's times to engage with others or be alone. And there's times to think. There's times to sleep, right? And so if we're really trying to push to it, it's like ultimately one of the things we're trying to do is trying to understand and help people to calibrate on in this moment, in this context, with the people I'm engaging in, based on my learning history on what happened in the past, what is the right balance of things that I should be doing towards moving towards a more healthy life, both for myself, for my family, for the ecosystems I exist within. And so in many ways, you can see I'm very consciously flipping success away from the sort of classic baseline to 6-month or 12-month to instead success is actually defined in a given moment, in a context, taking into account the context and the history for that person in that context. And that is an incredibly hard thing to do well. But I also hope you'll see seeds of how we can move towards this with the control systems approach that I've been advancing. So just to kind of summarize, the methods that we need to match the complexity of the phenomena we're trying to study. In my mind, it needs to enable us to be able to study not the nouns and what is happening and what it is, but really the dynamics, the interconnectivity, and the flows within and across these various imaginarily bounded systems that we create. And ultimately, because we're in applied science, we want to move towards supporting dynamic, contextually grounded decisions. So in my view, that's what we're striving for when it comes to system science. And I see that as a pretty radical shift from where we've classically built out our methods. And of course, I'd be happy to get in discussions. Maybe I just see the world too complexly and maybe things are more simple. Happy to get into that conversation because I would love to be wrong, honestly, with what I'm saying. So then moving this on to digital health. And knowing that this is a digital health conversation, I'm not going to get into the depths of this. I think you all know about different digital health tools we have, with these smartphones, all the data analytics and whatnot. I would basically argue that digital health all of the tools that we have now is enabling us to engage in this more system science approach to behavioral research. And so this is a really critical thing to note. I don't blame any work in the past that was done. We didn't have the tools and resources to be able to pull off and do this type of study that we can now do. I think though with digital health, it allows us to do, in my view, a paradigm shifting way of thinking about what is the purpose of our science and how do we do it well. So then moving forward, moving into the opportunity, I'm going to ground this again specifically in an approach I've been spending a lot of time on, control systems engineering. And this is a team of folks that my students, particularly Daniel Rivera, the person standing in the very center, is my close colleague. We've been working on this for years together. So now if we're going to control systems engineering as a concrete system science example, let me also link this to conversations that are happening already in behavioral science, particularly the concept of tailoring. And so I like to use Crowder and Skinner's definition offered in 2000 of tailoring. Any combination of information or change strategies, and notice they bolded these, but I think it's very important to highlight again, intended to reach one specific person based on characteristics that are unique to that person, related to the outcome of interest, and have been derived from an individual assessment. So notice here, where the ideal concept of tailoring is to actually make a decision and and tailor and adjust support based on an individual person's response. The question is, and so that sets up kind of two questions. What might you want to be tailoring, and how do you tailor? And let me unpack both of those. And in particular, the what do you tailor? I've honestly given entire talks on this one slide. So I'm sorry, I'm only going to give one slide on this, but hopefully we'll get into this conversation. But the first thing in my mind is you have to think about what are the different reasons on why you might want to tailor and make adjustments. And I would suggest that there's many plausible dimensions, but I think there's at least two that I tend to think a lot about. One is basically trying to tailor to the moment and the context. And so you can see this is basically the vertical axis. So on the optimal side, you're getting at the exact just-in-time moment, the JIT, as JIT suggests, just-in-time moment when a person will be most likely to respond favorably to this. Versus on the opposite side, you're not taking into account context at all, when, where, and what state to intervene. And then the other one, and this is the one I think we more commonly think about, the one on the x-axis, is the trajectory of change. And so you can think about this is very much like the trans-theoretical model, where your goal is to understand where is your current behavior change process and how do we match that to the right behavior change techniques, right? So if you're in contemplation or preparation, action, so forth and so on, right? So that is a strategy where you're trying to tailor based on where someone is at. Now you can see, now that with these two dimensions, you can see that there's actually, in my mind, at least 4 different classes, although really these are dimensional. This is definitely not, I wouldn't put these as categories. I would say these are different dimensions and just grounding them in these 4 different types. So the classic one that I think we've started with is the targeting intervention, the one on the bottom left, right? We're not taking into account timing. We're not taking into account change. We're just making a decision in a single moment. And so this is things like blood type or taking into account gender and selecting one intervention for one type of group or another. Going up this one, not taking into account change at all, you can go up to these just-in-time interventions. And so an example of this would be something like sending a flu shot. And the key thing is here, you're going to try to figure out the exact moment when someone would likely do it. So if someone's walking by a clinic, you try to give the delivery right in that moment when they could do it right then and there. That's a just-in-time style intervention. But notice it's still a single snapshot, but that's a totally legitimate, in my mind, status and style of intervention. Going down to the bottom right, the longitudinal adaptive intervention, this is the one where you're really trying to adapt the trajectory of change for a person over time. Okay, and so this is like getting someone to move from sedentary to being regularly active or losing weight or so forth and so on. The key here is that you're not necessarily taking into account exactly when you should intervene. You're just paying attention to their change process and adjusting based on what you see. And then last but not least is you try to combine getting the right moment and paying attention to the trajectory of change. And that's how I personally conceptualize of a JEDI, a just-in-time adaptive intervention. And so for today, I'm actually going to not focus on a JEDI, although that's a very active area of my research. I'm going to focus on the longitudinal adaptive interventions for now. But again, in the discussion, I'd be happy to get into the implications of this for JEDIs. So if that's what we're tailoring, the next question is, well, then how do you tailor? And so these first two come straight out of Matt Crowder's work and definitions. The first one is the generic one. And this is arguably what we do classically, right? We run randomized controlled trials to figure out if, quote, it works or not for a population, right? And so this is from randomized controlled trials. We learn about those. And so that's our reference. And so the first layer of actual tailoring is targeted interventions. And how do we do this? How do we figure out that? We can run population-based work like randomized controlled trials, and we add in a priori hypotheses about moderation. You know, I hypothesize a priori that men will respond well to this intervention, women will respond well to that kind of work. So now moving it forward more, we then get to adaptive interventions. And this definition is offered now from Linda Collins, particularly the work that's been coming out from the multi-phase optimization strategy, and then and really very much Susan Murphy's work on this. And so the idea here for these adaptive interventions is that your goal is to adjust provision of support over time. So this is where you get into it could either be the longitudinal adaptive or just-in-time adaptive. Both are legitimate. But then the trials that you're running are focused on the SMART or MRT. So that stands for the sequential multiple assignment randomized trial or the microrandomization trial. Both methods, by the way, particularly the MRT, is something I'm very actively involved in. I think there's a lot of value and strength in thinking about this type of work. But here's the key thing that I want to hit on for even this style of methods. The way that you're going to build the adaptive intervention, so the how do you tailor, is from prior participants. So the idea is you run a microrandomization trial, which basically means you randomize delivery of support for an intervention or not over time at meaningful decision points. So like every morning you randomize if you give somebody, a cue to have them plan out a physical activity for their day, like do an implementation intentions or not, And what you do is you look for the factors that might identify if someone will respond well to that intervention or not. So the planning, the implementation intentions. We found in our microrandomization trials that people didn't do that on the weekends. Great. So now we have this if-then rule. Basically, if it is the weekend, don't send a planning suggestion to them. Right? So you can see that's an adaptive intervention. But the key thing to note is that the information was built on prior participants, not the people you're trying to support in the next cohort. And that's the distinction that I want to make to this last class that I've been trying to argue for, which is a tuning intervention or continuous tuning. So in many ways, it's very similar to an adaptive intervention. You're adjusting provision of support, but here's the difference. You add in an element of real-time optimization to the individual using the intervention. Okay, and so now you can see, by the way, this is going to the logical extreme that Matt Crowder's definition of tailoring gets to, right? You're taking into account an individual assessment for an individual person. And so the reason why this matters is, and I'll show you an example of this within our own work, what if people respond differently? What if that if-then rule that you got from the adaptive world of methods isn't right? Like as an example, like what if for some people when they're stressed, they walk more, but for other people when they're stressed, they walk less? And maybe for some other people, stress doesn't matter. Maybe it's something else, like day of the week in that previous example, right? And so what you need is methods that can actually learn about that person and learn about your strategy for adaptation and feasibly adjust it. And so I'm going to be describing an approach from control systems engineering when this is what this system ID, system identification, and COT, control optimization trial is. But I also want to emphasize, and coming back to, I use a variety of different methods, I'm actively involved in this. You can also extend the microrandomization trial logic to add in a thing called reinforcement learning, although I'm not going to get into that at all, but I'm happy to get into that in the discussion. Okay, so now I hope you can see the distinction. Oftentimes we focus on generic and maybe targeted. I think people are moving into adaptive, and I'm arguing that if we want to actually handle the complexity of human behavior, that context matters, things change, and therefore people are different, we might actually need to be building continuous tuning interventions such that we have self-correcting mechanisms in the tool themselves. And so I'm going to describe how that works in control systems engineering. So what is control systems engineering? It's a very broad old field that's been around for over 100 years. And the broad focus is on making decisions in dynamic environments. And so you can think about an autopilot on a boat or an autopilot on a plane or robotics or adjusting temperature gauges. You have engaged with a control system probably today, you just didn't know it. So the field is very old. There's lots of really strong methods. Daniel and I and others now, David Conroy and whatnot, are really trying to advance using those methods and approaches within human behavior. And why? In brief, because it matches really well to what a health coach does. And so let me simplify it to its bare minimum that there's basically three things going on in a control system. First, you have something you're paying attention to. In this context, it's physical activity. So imagine a health coach, right? A health coach is paying attention to someone's physical activity. So that's one. Two, the health coach has something they can do to influence that, such as providing someone daily goals or rewards or implementation intentions or any of the various behavior change techniques that we have. But for now, we'll just stick with goals and rewards. And then three, the health coach knows what, quote, good is. Getting people to 150 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity or 10,000 steps a day or something like that. And this is the key thing, monitoring those things. So basically monitoring physical activity, trying things out, seeing how people respond and adjusting, that's a closed loop system. That is a control system. And so in many ways, what we're doing is we're trying to create what a health coach does within a digital technology platform. And this is a continuous tuning intervention. So continuing to move forward and trying to make this more concrete. I forgot thing. Right. So just to kind of come back to why this is really needed and why there's a mismatch, right? So, and again, this is not to negate this important work from Bess Marcus. This is over 20 years ago, right? So this was fantastic cutting edge work when it happened. This is a classic randomized control trial, basically exploring a tailored intervention, the IT versus a standard intervention. And you can see when we classically look at like the behavior change strategy, when we're using these group stuff, we get these nice clean lines of effects. And of course, there's something valuable here. I'm not saying that we can't learn from this past. The rub is if we're really trying to understand why and how, really doing this rigorous tailoring, well, this is more of like what the behavior change process looks like. And so this is a paper that one of my former postdocs, Guillaume Chavant's led. And what this is trajectories of steps per day within a physical activity, actually in a weight loss trial. And you can see that there's all these different types of patterns of response that doesn't follow that nice, clean, linear line that we might so often, when you average it out, you might be able to get that. But in terms of how the individuals are actually engaging in these things, it often has more of a flavor like this, where there's lots of ups and downs and adjustments and whatnot. And so the key for a control system is to be able to actually help in that level of complexity. Okay, so that's what we're coming back to this idea of building these longitudinal adaptive interventions. So coming in, building back on this continuous tuning intervention example, our intervention is doing something that we're always trying to do, right? And you can see the three parts that I mentioned of a control system. We're trying to increase physical activity, so we're monitoring that every day among inactive adults by adjusting the daily step goals and the expected rewards with ultimately, and this is how we know if we're making progress, trying to achieve 10,000 steps a day. Now, technically, because we're very idiographic in our approach, it's not really 10,000 steps a day. It depends on the demographic group. But for the sake of this conversation, let's just say 10,000 steps a day. Okay, so if that's what we're going for, then how do we really do it well? And so I'm going to be grounding this in some prior work that we did. This was just a small study. We now have actually a new large-scale grant where we're going to be doing a much larger trial with about 400 people to really test out the methods. That's not one of the things we're actively working on. But I'm starting with just sort of our pilot work that allow us to get those funding. So there's basically two key steps: course tuning and fine tuning. Course tuning you could think of as, it's called system identification or system ID. What are you doing with system ID? System ID focuses on modeling of dynamical systems, such as humans, so the human is the dynamic system here, from data, ideally from experimentation, not merely observation. And I'll show you what I mean by experimentation in a moment. But this is the key distinction that I want to hit on here. It is not focused on effect size estimates. Okay, so we're not trying to understand if the intervention works. We're trying to understand how the person and the interventions interact with each other to help us make better decisions. Okay, and so that's what I mean by it's focused on estimating and validating models to describe the system, the human. Okay, and so here's a concrete example of an experiment. So again, we're playing around with goals and points, and these points translate into gift cards in this context. So the short summary is, if we want to understand how someone responds to high goals and low goals, we need to manipulate high goals or low goals. And that's basically what this first row, the top row, is showing you. We base this on a person's baseline level of steps. So if they walk, on average 5,000 steps a day, that becomes their baseline reference. So, and what we do is we use a pseudo-random signal, which we don't have time to get into, but it basically allows us to get the properties we want of randomness, but it's better for doing this estimation and validation. We basically give people high goals sometimes, low goals some other times, and some other medium goals in between. Similarly, we do the same thing with points. We give them high goals some days and low goals and whatnot. But then we also monitor a variety of factors. So like when they actually achieve their goal, we document that and we say, does that actually have an impact when they actually get their points, which we think we would based on classic behavioral theory. We also pay attention to data, such as if it's a weekend or weekday, as well as a lot of things like how stressful do you think the day will be, and how busy will you be, and how typical is this day for you, and whatnot. And so this is what I mean by a system ID experiment. You'll notice here, we're studying the dynamics. We're not studying if the intervention works, we're studying how it works, okay? And so what does this get us? Well, the first thing it gets us is building individualized tailoring variables. And so what is this little table I'm showing you? We built, for this type of approach, everything is done on an N of 1 or idiographic basis. And so the idea is that we're building models that are descriptive for each person. And so what we did is we ran models to see how their contextual and other variables were influencing their physical activity. And so each number represents an individual person. So you can see 5 people in this. Basically, we found were really responsive to weekend. But you can see there are other people, such as typical and weekend was the next big one, or how busy they were, and so forth and so on, right? So the key thing to note here, coming back to this, like the difference between an adaptive versus a continuous tuning intervention, if I only did the adaptive world, what I would have done is I would have chosen weekend. And this is also, we ran the nomothetic, the group-based analyses to find this. Like we basically said, yep, on average, weekend matters. And so what it means is we would do that decision, like if it's the weekend, we don't send the intervention is the general idea. But I want you to notice here that that is a good decision for 5 of the 20 people in this. But it's not necessarily the right decision for 15 of the 20 people. So 75%, that's actually not a very good individualized tailoring variable to use. You see it? You need to build structures to actually take that into account, and that is getting into a coarse tuning approach. Okay, so that's the one thing you get. But then the second thing that's really important is we're not trying to understand if the intervention works, we're understanding how it works. And so what we're doing is we're building these models. And so the way that these models, I can't get into the depths of how it works, but the story short is look at the black line versus that like pinkish line. The black line is the actual steps, and that pink line is the predicted steps that our model is generating for a person. And so you can see in this context, it's not perfect, but it's pretty darn good, right? And by the way, this is not just cherry-picked data. We actually, for every person, we explain between 5% of the variance to about 40% of the variance in their individual person's steps using these models, okay? And so what does this get us? It allows us to make predictions on their future response from them. So now again, we're getting to this this coarse tuning approach. Okay, and this then allows us to get to the fine tuning part, which ultimately is coming back to these ideas of success criteria. And so again, if we're paying attention to time, we want to honor the fact that time is changing. And so there might be different goals at different points. So at first, we might be striving to get someone to get to 10,000 steps a day. But once they get there, we want to add in a second criteria, which is, okay, we want you to keep at 10,000 steps a day, but we also want the intervention to interact with you as little as possible, right? We basically want to shut the intervention off. Why? Because we don't want you to get addicted to the system or require the system. We want the person to have self-regulatory capacity. Okay, and there's a lot of theory you get into. For us, we get into a lot of operant theory around expanding variable reinforcement schedules and stuff that we code into the system. But again, I don't have time to get into that. For now, methodologically, notice that we have these success criteria that we're paying attention to. And what we want to do is we want to close the loop and actually study that and actually make decisions. So now it's the difference between describing and understanding, which is what System ID did, versus actually making decisions. That's what a controller does, particularly this hybrid model predictive controller. That's just one type of many algorithms. So what I want you to notice is that behavioral model, this up here, this is what we produced with the system identification experiment. So what does that give us? It gives us a capacity to basically the controller to use that to run simulations. It basically says, what happens tomorrow if I give a person really high goals? What if I give them really low goals? What happens if it's going to be, hot tomorrow or otherwise for this person, right? It runs all these scenarios and it adds in noise and variance. And ultimately what it does is it basically is just doing a very simple math equation. Which decision is the highest likelihood of producing the desired response, which is eventually getting someone to sustained physical activity steps, not just tomorrow, but into the future. And the simulation, by the way, involves that, not just like simulating what's going to happen tomorrow, but simulating a year out and taking that into account, such that, for some people, you might be able to get them to be really active for a few days, but then you're actually hurting them in terms of long-term behavior change. The controller runs these simulations and uses that to make decisions. And so that's how the closed loop intervention works. But now the key thing is, going back to this idea of a tuning intervention, it also has self-regulatory strategies for making the adjustments within it. And so what do I mean by that? In essence, every day the controller is making a decision, and it's offering that to someone. And so literally every single day is a mini experiment for the controller to see how well its prediction is. And the controller literally takes that into account. Like, it makes a prediction, it sees what it's done, and if its predictions are bad, the controller will make adjustments. It's like, oh, the model's not actually that useful. I'm going to focus a little bit more on adding more variance so I can learn more from the person. Those are the sorts of things that the equation actually does. A controller makes decisions on. And so you get into this fine-tuning control using what we were calling a control optimization trial. And there's a wide range to do this. The thing that matters most is the success criteria you have. And so you notice there's sort of three things that we want to do in this particular control optimization trial. First is, we want to understand the person. We want to build a dynamical model. So this is the coarse tuning, right? We want to do the system identification. Once we have that, we want the controller to use that to run simulations to help someone move towards getting meaningfully and sustained levels of physical activity, the 10,000 steps a day. And if and when they start meeting that, we then start telling the system to stop interacting with them. And you can see this very clearly in how this is a simulation just to demonstrate the idea, but you can see that the points actually start shutting themselves off. But you can also see that if someone has a disruption in their life right here, that the system can turn back on. Be like, oh, okay, well, you actually need some support. Let me turn this back on for you, right? And then I get back to it, and then you shut it off, and then even the goals start just disappearing, right? This is a control optimization trial where the system is literally making these adjustments, and we can learn quite a bit about the dynamics of human behavior. We're understanding how and why behavior happens, okay? So just to summarize the first half, or the like 2/3 of this talk, which is much more on the system science piece, the system science methods and this is just one approach, control system, allows us to match the complexity of the phenomenon we're trying to study in behavioral science work. It enables us to study the dynamics, the interconnectivity, and the flows within and across these various systems. We can see how a person is interacting with the other systems in their context, the families, the communities, and we can take that into account to make a better decision for that person. And ultimately, we're grounding this work around supporting dynamic and textually grounded decisions for that person, getting towards that aspiration of moving towards calibrating and balancing these in-the-moment decisions versus more of that kind of yardstick approach. And I just want to reemphasize, there's a variety of other really good, robust system science methods, growing more from computer science or from physics and whatnot. I don't have time to get into them, but I'm actually involved in trying to understand them. Because for me, I'm really big on thinking about recognizing that every method has a strength, but every method is based on an assumption and therefore always has an inherent limitation. And so I'm all about using triangulation as approach, where each method, if they all start pointing in a common direction, I have increased confidence in it. And so for me, essential part of system science is recognizing these multiple epistemologies. Okay, so now we're going to make a pivot though. There are often a variety of unintended consequences going on. And this is, I think, why I really appreciate your power to the people question and the broader frame for this. I think it's important to remember that even with good intent, these things can do great harm. And so there's a lot of ones that are already discussed quite a bit in the literature and otherwise, right? There's the digital divide, right? Where some people have these tools and don't. That in particular sets up a high risk of propagating inequities, particularly when you're doing something like what I just described, these precision interventions. Because if you're building these and they're really highly tuned to people with money and wealth and resources, well, you're going to likely help them get a lot better, and you're going to leave the people who need it most even farther behind. And of course, there's a whole other area around privacy. And then in my mind, the one that I'm, like all of these I'm scared of, but this one I'm particularly scared of manipulation. Like, I'm creating these tools. I didn't talk to the person I'm trying to build in a meaningful way beyond, just sort of informed consent, such that they actually understand what this is doing and can kind of, I think about it as almost, I'm trying to build tools that are like glasses. I want people to know what it does so much that they can also know when they can take those glasses off and be like, yeah, I don't need that right now. I want them to know what's going on with the digital tools enough such that they can actually choose not to use them when they feel like it's actually hindering them, which I think is very important when you get into the broader digital health world, right? So, but I want to push this even further because I think those are the classic things we think about. I want to make this more personal and think about what does it mean as individual researchers and scientists? And in particular, I want to ask this question of what happens when, quote, normal hurts. And so this is a very big thing. I imagine you're seeing the kind of crazy political unrest that's happening here in the United States. And so as I've been engaging with this and learning about things like anti-racism and whatnot, I've been really just struck by just, even with good intent, you can do great harm. And so the first thing to note is just sort of recognizing history and context. So for example, sexism and its impact and its everyday impact on influencing people, or the role of race and racism, in particular racism, as this socially driving factor that can, literally the term is weathering, whether a person's a Black person or otherwise, or indigenous, where they embody and get hurt through just living in the normative structure, to of course also ableism, designing for things where a person is, quote, disabled just because of the way the system has been set up, right? And so with this as a little bit of background, I think it's really important to then think about, well, how do these sort of normative structures reside within us as scientists, and what can we do about them? And in particular, I'm just making this pivot. I'm talking about work that I did with my friend Dana Lewis. And if you don't know Dana, the long story short about Dana is she's a person with type 1 diabetes who, with her now husband, Scott, built a control algorithm for actually building an open artificial pancreas system. She then opened that control algorithm online, open sourced it. It became available. Now there's over thousands of people that actually use this tool. And she and this DIY community have had a huge impact on shifting and improving the care for persons with type 1 diabetes. So Dana and I, when we met, there was only 8 people who had used this when we first met. And I was really excited about this. And I was really interested in trying to provide support to her. And so I went up to her and I was basically like, that's amazing. How can I help you with this work? And so we ended up getting this Robert Wood Johnson Foundation grant. And so getting to this idea of norms, I want to show you something. So one of the things that when we started doing this before we got the grant was we started talking to a bunch of different researchers who are working on, DIY, do it yourself, citizen science, and these sort of various terms that are floating around. So we ended up having a conversation, and this diagram grew out of it. And let me tell you a little bit about the story. Long story short, Dana and I were on a call with someone, and this person who is a, quote, expert in citizen science, very good intent, very good person. This is not questioning the person. This is about understanding how norms get embodied within ourselves, okay? So please don't think I'm making a judgment about the person. The person has good intent. I see this person as a moral, good human being. But it's the embodiment of these normative structures that can hurt is what I want you to focus on. So what happened? We were on a call, and this person started describing Dana's work as if Dana were not on the call. And so she was basically describing what Dana did, not referencing Dana or asking if it was true. She actually then offered things that were factually inaccurate about Dana's work in front of Dana, but speaking as the authority figure on it, even though Dana's the one that literally built the artificial pancreas system that she was speaking of. And she did not refer to Dana. She was speaking about Dana in the third person as if she were not on the call, speaking to me. Okay. And so Dana and I both thought this was very strange. And I kept trying to basically direct it back to Dana's on the call. Why don't you ask her a question? And so after the call, Dana basically made this quick little diagram for me. And so you can see the idea is basically like a patient saying XYZ is what's key. But then what happens is, okay, fellow researchers, what do we see as the answer to whatever the thing is, right? And then another researcher says, clearly ABC is the answer. And then say, okay, ABC it is, let's write the paper. And so you start building this loop. And I think about this now as an epistemology trap. You have this normative structure where you're undermining the knowledge and wisdom of the person you're trying to support in the work. right? So this is the idea of embodying these normative structures that might actually hurt people. And this was very problematic. And we've, like, a lot of what we worked on in this project was trying to unpack and try to think through how do we change cultures based on these unintended consequences. And in particular, knowing I'm kind of running a little lower on time, the key thing I want to hit on is that good intent is not enough. You really need to do a lot of self-work. And I invite you to read this, go to this website, ouropeningpathways.org, and particularly read this thing of sort of my history of all the times when I had good intent, but through the normative structures that I was living within, I ended up potentially resulting in harm, although thankfully I think I had enough awareness to move past it. And in particular, this little diagram, if you know the Dunning-Kruger effect, I learned firsthand how I can personally embody Dunning-Kruger, or as I like to call it, confident ignorance, but also how to move past that. And that's kind of the key thing that I want to try to move forward on this. So coming back to this idea of normative structures and like how we do science, I think there's a lot of stuff we can learn from psychology. For example, the importance of stereotyping. What happens when we literally call a person a subject or a patient and we dehumanize them? We don't fully see them as the complex intersectional person that they are. We can start falling into these traps of thinking that they might not have abilities. Like you might hear Dana, when I first said Dana's a person with type 1 diabetes and she doesn't have any formal training in engineering, but she built her own artificial pancreas system. That's stereotype breaking. Right? And it's happened. There's more people that have these abilities than not. Now, and so the interesting thing then, the next step of that is recognizing the role as professionals is, and this again, this comes from good desires. We want to try to help people by building tools that are safe. Right? But the unintended consequences, if we try to design towards a stereotype of patients that are basically completely passive, and of course there are going to be some of those people, we want to honor that, right? But there's also these other types of people like Dana who can do the work. If we systematically cut them out, we can be falling into the omission bias variation, which if you don't recall this from your psychology training, it's basically the idea that we bias towards inaction over action. Right. So as psychologists, like, as scientists, we're going to bias towards, we're not going to put this out until it's really safe for everybody. Right. But if we do that and we don't invite people like Dana into the conversation, we're setting up this risk where those people that are actually being hurt. And it's important to remember, type 1 diabetes is something that literally kills people every night. So we have this belief that, we can't put it out till it's safe. But what if the person's lived experience is unsafe? That was actually why Dana got started building this. She basically was a heavy sleeper and she wanted to make sure that when she went to bed, she would wake up in the morning, right? So our omission bias to try to save has unintended consequences if we're making decisions based on stereotypes, not based on the complexities of what we're actually working on. And last but not least, you can see how if people internalize those stereotypes, like being a patient and just being so, like basically wait until we solve it for you, that's setting up a variation of learned helplessness of basically, no, don't do that. Don't step up. Don't be that persnickety patient. And a lot of our socio-scientific norms are built around this idea that basically says, wait for us to solve this problem for you. I think this is evolving, of course, right? But this is what I mean by normatives being baked into you and how even with good intent, you might do harm. Okay. And so part of this is learning how to train ourselves to get beyond that and recognize then, ultimately, coming back to this idea that we're in applied science, it requires us to bridge is and ought thinking. And this is a distinction made by David Hume long ago. The long story short is around trying to understand the facts. And this is very science-based, is trying to describe the past and the present. But ought is the world as someone might want it to be. So this is more about morality and ethics and future orientations. And think about literally what my control system work is doing, is making predictions on future responses. So who is the person or people who should be defining those success criteria? Should it be the scientist or should it be the people we're serving? I would argue it's the people we're serving. But I don't think that we classically build our tools in a way that actually builds that check on our work. And so just trying to move this forward and in the last few minutes, sort of knowing that there's a lot more to unpack. I'd honestly love to give a talk just on this humanistic side. But just to kind of wrap it up with a few kind of concrete, what might this mean in terms of the future of how we train scientists and even how we as individual scientists act to try to do well at this incredibly hard tasks of bridging is and ought thinking. There's three areas that I want to emphasize. Actually, first, I think the key thing to note, and you can see this in how I'm thinking about my work, the classic way that I think we've often built up our work is we try to produce that transportable knowledge or generalizable knowledge. And we don't have to get into why I like transportable better, but think generalizable for now, right? The idea is we build that knowledge, it disseminates to clinics, and then we help individuals. In my mind, the first thing we want to do is we want to align our goals with the people we're trying to serve. And so for me, the first goal is actually to help people, help the individuals we're trying to work with. And if we don't achieve success there, we don't go on to try to produce transportable knowledge. That's not the point. The point first is to help. And then you can build scientific methods where you start adding in this nomothetic work. You start looking for patterns and clusters, and then you actually experimentally and meaningfully test through things like DAGs and whatnot, and I don't have time to get into that depth, but you can actually build a science, but you're building first on honoring the complexity of context matters, things change, and people are different. Okay, so that's first is just the flip, right? But then as I came back to this, like, how do you know these normative structures, and how do you get beyond the idea that good intent is not enough? Well, in my mind, you can think about these in terms of dimensions. Like on one side, I think it's easy for us to fall into variations of entitlement. I've worked hard, I've got the degree, I know best. Versus on the opposite of that, having enough humility to sort of honor and recognize the full person that you are working with and recognize that they might know things that you don't, versus confidence ignorance as another dimension, right? Where we're thinking we know more than we actually do. And I think a countervailing force to this is curiosity. Emotional blindness. This is the idea that if you've never had the lived experience, if you've never really felt oppression, if you've never felt the experience of weathering that Black and Indigenous people of color experience in their worlds, it's going to be very hard for you to engage with it. It's like asking someone to study and work on cows if they've never seen a cow before, And so a key part of that is building, notice I'm not using the word empathy, I'm using the word compassion very explicitly. Building that compassion to actually try to understand and engage and appreciate the world that that person's coming from. And last but not least, recognize that sometimes we have an intuition to be destructive, coming back to that sort of, we're just wait, it's not safe yet, so you can't do this, setting up a sort of learned helplessness, right? And so instead, it's sort of like honoring this complexity and move towards more creative actions. And so in my mind, this is building up a mindset and cultivating a humanistic mindset as my cat jumps on my table. And so there's three things that I want you to think about when you work on this. First, mindful that these things can happen within yourself. And I am guilty of all of these things, just to be clear. I think we all are. It's not that we are bad people. It's that we have bad habits and routines. So it's a behavior change problem. So first thing to know is just how to assess for it. The second thing is to know what we're striving for. What is our goal? I think we want to be striving for humility, curiosity, compassion, and creative actions. And a sort of strategy that I've been using is asking questions for myself. So ask yourself this: how do you know what you know? What else might be true? What harmful normal lives in me? And then last but not least, knowing that we can't just sit into decision paralysis because that's a variation of omission bias, what is the next right thing to do? Because we do have a responsibility. We can't negate our responsibility as scientists. So first step, recognizing that there is personal work for you to do. Second, meaningfully partnering with others. And this is basically getting into the opening pathways work. And I don't have time. I went over already at beyond my 50 minutes. So we're at 51 on my clock. So in brief, it's about working towards working with the people you're trying to serve and having them really be meaningful partners with your work. And then the last step and essential to that is recentering away from the goals of success that we have, which are important, but they should only be part of it. They shouldn't be centered on that. It should be centered on the people, because we're in an alt world, we're in applied science, centering on the people we're trying to serve, their success criteria. So who defines the success criteria? And making sure that they, like the people we're serving, do. Who defines the categories that define these people, right? Like a lot of people don't necessarily agree with the racial categories here in the US that are put on them, for example, right? That's important. That has implications for how we think about our science and our work. Who defines the safeguards and checks, like that glass example of taking it off? And then last, how do we cultivate agency and power over the tools we are building among those the tools are meant to serve? I think often we don't do that nearly enough in our thinking. And this is what I mean by recentering, is sort of asking these questions as we build our work. So to summarize, and I am now done, system science methods allow us to match the complexity of a phenomenon by studying these dynamics and interconnectivities and supports and using multiple epistemologies. But since we're doing an applied science work, we must also recognize and be deeply humble and work towards aligning our work to the future aspirations of the people we're serving, not just the scientific pursuit that we have. In my view, this is a pathway towards a more equitable applied behavioral science. Thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.